Hello, everybody, and welcome to Social Work and Politics with Dr. Stephen Pimpare, brought to you by the NASW Vermont chapter. We're so happy that you are here. Stephen, thank you so much, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and good afternoon, everybody. So let me tell you what it is that I have in mind for us. I'll talk for a bit and it'll proceed as follows. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening, and I'm marking time. It is Monday, February 10th at 12:04, and things are moving quickly. So I'll talk about what's happening. I'll offer some suggestions about how to think about it. I will spend the bulk of my time offering some suggestions about what you can do, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So first thing I want to say is that I think it is wise for us not to overread the meaning of the election and assume that this is what most people want. Keep in mind that more eligible voters didn't vote at all than voted for Trump or Harris. The words of journalist Laura Jadid, I think, are also useful in this context. She wrote, "It was helpful to remember that 77 million people did not vote for what I think is going to happen, but for what they think is going to happen." So, irrespective of what people thought, what's happened so far? So much of what we are seeing is awful, but not necessarily surprising. This is indeed large chunks of the Project 2025 agenda unspooling. I'll return to this. What I think it is fair to say no one saw coming was Elon Musk's apparent takeover of federal payment systems and what appears to be complete control over all national government accounts, possibly. So this alone is constitutional crisis stuff, right? And there's lots going on that is clearly illegal and clearly unconstitutional. And it's an open question right now as to whether there are people and institutions who will stop it. In a rational world in which the system were functioning, Congress would impeach and remove immediately. That's not the world we are in. And in part, some reporting suggests because people are literally afraid of being murdered if they disobey. So what's going on? We've currently got 45, as of 11:30 this morning, 45 lawsuits recorded at the Just Security Litigation Tracker challenging actions of the administration. I'm just going to tick through the range of violations that we've seen so far. So we've got 14th Amendment violations, right, in the directive to reject birthright citizenship. More 14th Amendment violations denying the full faith and credit of U.S. debt. We've got 10th Amendment, Conscription Act, and Posse Comitatus violations, which is the DOJ, Department of Justice order sending troops to the border and efforts to try to force states to cooperate. We've got emoluments clause potential violations. Those are bribes, basically. And we learned just this past weekend of 31 uninvestigated election law violations by the Trump campaign. We've got Americans with Disability Act and Civil Rights Act violations with shuttering diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs. The Administrative Procedures Act, that's the firings without cause of civil servants. We've got Impoundment Control Act violations. That's shutting down programs that Congress created and authorized, like USAID, the largest relief organization in the world. And then we've got the counterpart of the Impoundment Control Act, the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says that the president cannot spend money that has not been authorized by Congress. We've got violations of the Privacy Act of 1974. That's a lot of the Elon Musk stuff. We've got Finance Protection Act violations. This is OMB Director Vaught shutting down the agency, it appears. We've got international war crimes by calling for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. We've got Fifth Amendment violations. Think about search and seizure violations, which raids we've seen in Newark and elsewhere. And we've got due process Fifth Amendment violations at Guantanamo, where last reporting I saw said there are maybe already 50 people who have been carried away to what appears to be a legal black hole where they seem to be basically building a concentration camp. Surrounding lots of this, we've got take care clause violations. This is the part of the Constitution that says the president needs to take care that the law be faithfully executed. And we've got First Amendment free speech violations, threatening schools for teaching history and then trying to impose propaganda upon them. So we've already got multiple injunctions in which the courts are getting involved, which the administration may be ignoring and maybe not. It's really hard to know a lot of this right now. But we do know that Trump himself, Vice President Vance, and Elon Musk have all suggested in the last 2 days, and Vance even previous, that the courts could and should be ignored. This is a constitutional crisis and the attempted destruction of the state itself. Or maybe it's the attempted privatization of government. Or maybe it's merely the centralization and consolidation of power. But unlike Trump 1.0, which did a lot of damage, this is potentially system destroying stuff. And I say this because we've got to stare it in the face and not act as if this is normal. It is really bad. And as I said to a friend over the weekend, there is no fear of hyperbole here. I'm okay if I occasionally sound a bit hysterical, given that lately it's the hysterics who have been right. All right. How should we start to think about this? First thing to keep in mind, this is literally meant to be overwhelming and dispiriting. They want you to feel helpless. If we listen to Trump advisor Steve Bannon, has for years been talking about what he calls the flood the zone or muzzle speed strategy. And the idea is that if they do 3 illegal things a day or 3 illegal things an hour, no one could pay attention to all of them. So maybe they'll get away with 1 or 2 of the 3. So that's thing 1. Thing 2, Trump is a symptom, not a cause. What we are witnessing has been at least 50 years in the making. Project 2025, which I hope you have heard about, the subtitle is Mandate for Leadership. The Heritage Foundation issued the first mandate for leadership, an agenda for an incoming Republican administration for the first administration of Ronald Reagan. And it looks really similar if you go back and look what they were proposing then and what they're proposing now. The difference is what they were proposing then was on the outskirts of even Republican agenda setting, and it is now sitting squarely at the center of their policy agenda. So what are they trying to do? I think first of all, we should call this an effort at resegregation, right? I think a lot of the pieces circle around to that. I think another big piece is literally undoing the 20th century welfare and regulatory state. Third, to make economic power the same thing as political power. I think that's part of how we understand Musk's involvement. And I lost track of the count, but last I heard there were more than 14 billionaires in senior leadership positions in the administration, right? But it is at its core, and this is part of why it so affects us, excuse me, it is racist, misogynist, and eugenicist that only recognizes the rights of straight white men. Last thing about the context that I want to point out, right? And I will circle back to this a little bit. This is not a problem that is going to be solved with the 2026 or the 2028 election. It is bigger than any single election. And we would have significant work to do even in a Harris administration, which if that were the world that we were in, which I can say more a little about later if folks want. All right. What do we do? So I've had a lot of people ask me, how bad do you think it will get? And my response has been some version of, depends on how bad we are willing to let it get. We each have some individual power, and we all have significant collective power. But that potential power does not activate itself. And what can sometimes be the usual excuses, It's not my role. I don't have time. I do my civic work through my job. It's not appropriate to get in politics. None of that will do in this moment. Sociologist Frances Fox Piven teaches us that in every relationship in which our willing participation matters to someone or something, our withdrawal of that willingness to participate or our threat to withdraw it is a source of power. Right? This is why the withholding of labor via a strike is effective. James C. Scott, in a book called Weapons of the Weak, also teaches us that there are many forms of what he calls everyday resistance that have been employed throughout history successfully by putatively powerless peoples. To quote him, they are foot dragging, dissimulation, desertion, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, sabotage, and so on. He goes on. Everyday forms of resistance make no headline, but just as millions of anthozoan polyps create willy-nilly a coral wreath, so do the multiple acts of insubordination and evasion create political and economic barrier reefs of their own. Or as U.S. House member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it very recently, tyranny is eroded by a sea of small acts. What does that mean? You don't need to do everything or even try to pay attention to everything, right? I am professionally obligated to sit in front of the fire hose and to try to understand as much as I can of all of this. You are probably not. Pick an issue or a population group that matters to you and focus your attention there. And for most of us, that's going to be more productive to focus locally rather than on national politics and policy, right? Start with basic human needs. Can you provide material relief? Right. This is a core principle of mutual aid, or you'll be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Before they can effectively help to build community and form coalitions to affect change, people have got to have their need for food, shelter, and security met. To that end, look around you. Which populations are most vulnerable? What can you do to help protect them? What risks are you willing to take and able to take to stand between agents of the state and people under threat? This will help you find your people, hugely important in these moments, and to build community. Successful political change work is done with others. Who are your allies? What work is already being done that you can contribute to? Right? So look at local community groups, at faith-based organizations, and mutual aid programs, right? And look for those spaces where your training and expertise can be of use to others. What can you contribute? What skills do you bring? Can you facilitate groups? Help people identify and access state or charity resources? But while you're doing this, think critically about who you are working with and for. Whose interests are they serving? Who is shaping the agenda? Whose voices are included and whose are excluded? Are you taking care not to assume that you should lead in these spaces simply because of your education or formal credentials? This is also, I think, a space where genuine cultural competence and simple humility will serve you well. All right, so there's more. Politics doesn't end simply because authoritarians occupy positions of power. And all of the usual means by which we try to influence policy and public opinion continue to be available and cannot be abandoned. So to that end, call your elected officials and press Democrats and independents to act like an opposition party and to defend those in need. It's a long body of research in political science that shows that elected officials overstate how conservative their constituents are because that's who they're most likely to hear from. Research also shows that they resist altering their own policy preferences because they are not getting a good read on actual public opinion. You can help alter that dynamic simply by reaching out and then by speaking out in every forum that you have available to you. Contact newsrooms and other media outlets to apprise them of the issues you think need more attention, to correct the record when they make errors or omit relevant perspectives, or to complain when they are aligning themselves with those in power rather than those at the end of the political bayonet. Remind them, and others who need reminding, not to treat neo-Nazis as possessing legitimate viewpoints. Remind them that you are either pro or anti-democracy, and there is no space for objectivity on the matter. Not that I think that objectivity is really a thing anyway. Likewise, any essentializing framework that challenges the basic humanity of any group of people does not warrant your understanding or your respect. While every instance in which groups with political power dehumanize others and make them an enemy doesn't inescapably lead to ethnic cleansing or genocide, every act of ethnic cleansing or genocide begins with the dehumanization of a marginalized population. And through all of this work, are you building power and disrupting efforts to cause harm, right? So think of that guidance from Piven and Scott that I noted above. Refuse to cooperate. Throw sand in the gears of everything. Become ungovernable. Make good trouble, as John Lewis advised us. What can you do to undermine the surveillance and policing of clients? Disrupt bureaucratic processes and look for spaces where you can direct support where you can. That is to say, if your role is determining eligibility for benefits from a government program, approve as many applications as you possibly can without drawing undue attention. This is a literal way to redistribute resources and the potential power that comes with it. Think about what are the other systems that you can turn to your advantage or the advantage of others? Or if there's no advantage to be had, how might you, in historian Eric Hobsbawm's formulation, work those systems to minimum disadvantage? Think about taking it a step further and organize and unionize your own workplaces whenever possible with an eye toward what's come to be called bargaining for the common good. So teachers do it by fighting not just for their own salary and benefits during contract negotiations, but for better learning conditions for their students, right? So they fight for smaller classes, newer books, more nurses, more social workers, or they fight for assistance for students' parents, right? English learning, language learning programs, affordable housing, even local progressive tax policies. Could press state and local governments to assert their own power. Urge your officials to ignore or reject the legitimacy of lawless or unjust court edicts or executive orders. Remembering that Thomas Aquinas, Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King have all asserted the basic principle that we have no moral obligation to obey an unjust law. What does that look like? Insist that your local school boards ignore book bans and restrictions on curricula and encourage the mass defiance of such edicts. One teacher is vulnerable if they refuse to tailor their curriculum to the whims of right-wing ideologues. But if teachers, parents, and administrators stand together, along with school social workers, they wield enormous power. Similar vein, urge your local district attorneys to refuse to prosecute politicized, petty, or racialized crimes and legitimize the idea of nullification, right? Educating people to the idea that juries can and should refuse to convict people of those kinds of offenses. Offenses. Final thought. These are all short-term disruptive strategies to slow down the authoritarian turn and to protect the most vulnerable. This work is urgent, but we must also build long-term plans that enshrine the best of social work values into policy and practice. Right? Those of us who believe in the imperative of an open, multiracial democracy that works toward maximizing the flourishing of all people need to be thinking long term at the same time that they're fighting for the short term, right? What's the left equivalent of Project 2025? While we play mostly defense in the short term, what are the things we should be building toward? And how do we get there? Right. So the grand challenges for our social work, right, offer this admirable agenda for policy change. But where's the agenda for the kind of fundamental, transformative political change that it's going to need to be enacted before those policies are practicable? Put differently, when we get to the other end of this, we're going to need another reconstruction. Only this time we can't allow the Confederacy to survive. And with that, I will stop talking. See what we've got for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. I am going to work backwards. Well, no. Oh, geez. Okay, they're all coming in. Will our U.S. military refuse to follow unlawful orders?
We don't know. I am not here to lie to you. We don't know. And when you look across the world at the rise of authoritarian regimes in other places, right, that's one of the key factors, right? Who do the military align themselves with? Right. We've got little bits and pieces of information. We know just this morning there was another slate of firings. There's clearly an effort to ensure that as many of Trump's loyalists as possible can be appointed into those positions. When even if you get some of the senior leaders who issue an illegal order, the Uniform Code of Military Conduct is really a thing, right? And those of you who are veterans, who have veterans in your life, you know this, right? That folks take that really seriously and take their oath to the Constitution rather than a single individual seriously, right? So for me, one of the questions is, if we enter a new period of mass protests and someone gives an order to shoot protesters, will they obey? We will learn a lot in that moment. We will learn a lot in that moment. And that's a very unsatisfying answer. But again, I'm going to try not to lie to you. I think we really need to sort of face as head on as we can the severity of what it is that we're facing.
Stephen, there was in the chat about the 5Calls is a great app with all the phone numbers of state representatives. But
Yep.
then the question, what if our politicians are part of the problem?
Call them anyway. Call them anyway. Let them know. Right? Focus on what's happening in your community and get people to call, right? Their phone should be ringing off the hook. It really will make a difference. It really, really, really makes a difference. And some of you may have elected representatives who are unpersuadable, but if, I don't know, we look at proposed cuts to the National Institutes of Health, which will hollow out medical centers and research facilities disproportionately in Republican majority states, right? That kind of impact is going to focus the attention of elected officials, right? And there is, I apologize, I don't have it handy, but there is now a couple of folks have put out an NIH tracker that literally just you can put in your state and it will show you institution by institution how much money would be lost if the proposal that they cut that funding by as much as 50% actually were to go through.
And
Call.
Stephen, if,
Yep.
if I can just add on to that, because this is something that I tell people a lot, that if you're nervous about calling, remember that the person who's answering the phone is a wonderful and bright undergraduate,
Yep.
oftentimes from American University or Dartmouth or someplace, poli-sci
Yep.
majors who are delighted to have that internship. And they're it is not their role to challenge you, to be rude. It is their role to be polite and and oftentimes they are just taking down like calls.
Yep.
We've had this many calls
Putting tick
on
marks on a sheet
check
about
marks
the issue.
about what people are concerned about. So, and Gretchen, thank you. So, Gretchen, I see that you have your hand up. Do you want to take yourself off of mute and ask?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Stephen. A question for you, which I hope you're comfortable answering. Are you familiar with Braver Angels?
I am not off the top of my head.
It's a national organization that promotes and supports constructive dialogue between red and blue.
Hmm.
Has national Zoom meetings and all of this, and I initially loved the idea, and now I'm starting to feel like what they do is they sort of support the conversation is most important. And I'm at the point where going, there's no conversation here. This is not about whether we pay for a dog warden or not. Do you have, I don't want to be a part of complacency. I don't want to be a part
Yeah.
of.
It's my thinking about that question changes sometimes day to day and hour to hour. Right. So it's messy and it's complicated, right? There is an old principle in organizing, right? Where if, you've been working in your community on a thing for a long, long period of time, and suddenly people who you've never seen before show up, you don't say to them, "Where have you been?" You say, "Welcome." And you bring them into the fight. That's how we build power, is bringing people in. I go back to Laura Jadid's observation that I started with, right? A lot of the people who, again, keep in mind all the people who just didn't show up to vote for whatever reasons, and we have a long, disappointing history of that, right? Very few, the data that we have available says that not zero, but a relatively small portion of the people who voted for Trump want what we are seeing, right?
Say that again.
Very few of the people who voted, some non-trivial but larger than zero number of people who voted for Trump actually voted for what we're seeing now, right? I don't want to drag myself too far down a rabbit hole, but we've got decades worth of research in political science that tells us over and over and over and over and over and over and over again that very few people pay attention to politics in any meaningful way or have any substantive knowledge about policy matters, right? Now, we live in our own bubbles, right? Because I am guessing that we've got lots of college degrees and probably lots of master's degrees and maybe a whole bunch of PhDs in the room as well. We are tiny minorities of the population. We tend to be the people who pay attention to politics. Most people don't. And they make decisions at the last minute based on vibes often. And this, right, predates Trump and continues to be true. So to get back at trying to answer that question, and you know this as clinicians, right? Don't begin with assumptions about who the other people in the room are, right? You are absolutely not going to be able to have some conversations with some of those people. But I don't see in the long run how we get to the other end of this without reknitting something that looks like a common project. And that's hard and messy and complicated. But I also think, remember back to the first Trump administration, wildly unpopular, right? Wildly unpopular, not least because of a devastating and fatal mishandling of a pandemic, right? So too will much of what will happen this time around be wildly unpopular, right? When, their, uncle who has worked a good government job in Minneapolis for his whole career suddenly finds himself unemployed. And that's happening, right? Like the million polyps that Scott talks about. And that's happening thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of times around the country. People start to pay attention in different kinds of ways. So I don't think the endeavor is useless. I think it's messy and complicated. And you've got to be the right sort of person to do that. But I think we're eventually going to have to.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question from the chat and then Catherine
Yep.
ask you. So again, the tea leaves. When all the resistance lawsuits eventually get to the Supreme Court, do you think John Roberts will hold the court and overrule Thomas and Scalia?
Couldn't tell you. What I will say is this. This court and precedent for decades have been continually engaged in a project to, I would argue, reinterpret what has been understood to be constitutional separations of powers in favor of an increasingly aggrandized and expanded executive, excuse me. Roberts, and this is less true than I used to think this is more true than I do now, right? He does understand that, as Alexander Hamilton put it, trying to convince us that the court would be a weak branch. How's that going? That what made the court weak was that it had neither the power of the sword nor the purse. That is, it doesn't have an independent army and it doesn't have an independent budget, right? It is entirely dependent, more or less, on Congress, right? And the legitimacy that it either does or does not have in the public, right? So I would, and this is me guessing because I have no tea leaves on this stuff, right? I can't read the future any better than anybody else. My guess is that there are some of these that will go too far, and he will use those as opportunities to generate positive propaganda about the court. Oh, look, see how balanced it is. It's not letting Trump get his way. But on other matters, it's, you got to count to 5, right? You need 5 votes for anything to happen or to allow lower court decisions to stand, right, and not intervene. I don't know. I would not have expected, right, I don't have lots of fond thoughts about this court as currently constituted. I, as a lot of people who pay attention, was genuinely surprised by how far the executive immunity decision went last summer. Like, genuinely surprised, right? I expected them to misread the Constitution in a way that I think is obscene. I did not expect them to carve out huge swaths of the presidency as literally immune from criminal prosecution. So I wouldn't have thought there would have been 5 votes for that. So I have been wrong in the past.
You, Catherine, do you want to take yourself off of mute?
Yes, thank you, Lynn. Yes, thank you. I asked that last question because it keeps me up at night, and being from a military background and intelligence background, I find myself thinking, what institution is going to hold the line? Is it going to be the Supreme Court? Is it going to be the apolitical US military? Or are we going to be overwhelmed? Or is there some way, some place where we can hold the line? But what concerns me, all of it, what you said, is like there's an Atlantic article you probably read by now. It's called How Hitler Dismantled Democracy in 53 Days. He used the Constitution to shatter the Constitution.
Yep.
And I have no question that in the way they're rolling this out, eventually they would also get and they would roll over the Supreme Court, as though they don't even realize that they're way down the line, but they are in the line to go. And how did Trump legally fire 14
Well, he didn't.
IGs?
He didn't.
It wasn't lawful. Like, how did even then?
But it happened.
It's like,
Yeah.
how? I mean, that must be part of the lawsuits, because that's just has to be
It is.
blatantly
Yeah, there are
illegal.
a bunch of those. The 45 that I pointed to, a bunch of those are about
Include the IGs.
Yeah, the illegal firings of the inspectors general. We say two things to that. One is I made reference to this. Trump, Vance, and Musk are laying the groundwork to reject. They'll do this selectively, but to reject court orders.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind, right, that they will do that to the extent that they can. One of the things that has been frustrating to me is, take, for example, was this last week? I think so. When U.S. Agency for International Development was being illegally shut down, right, and take over by Musk and the child programmers who are doing, we're not entirely sure what inside those systems, that there were finally, after what I thought was unconscionable delay, members of Congress going over to the office, being met with either a rent-a-cop or a BlackRock private security forces, which is what at least one of them looked like to me, and being told that they couldn't go in. And they said, oh, well, and went away. It's like, there's got to come a point, and I know not everybody can do this, right? They need to make them drag them off in handcuffs, right? They need to make this visible to the public, right? Because long stories in the Washington Post about what we think about, we know about what's going on to servers inside Department of the Treasury is not going to reach those inattentive voters that I was talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be visual. We live in a visual age, right? There need to be videos that can go viral on TikTok, right? And when members of Congress start being arrested and jailed, that will get public attention. There needs to be much, much, much more of that kind of resistance. Fight every place you can. Again, and I recognize different people have to make that calculation in different ways, given concerns for their own safety, health, and well-being of their families. But I am not counting on the courts to save us, right? There are some judges who will do what they can, but once the administration selectively starts to reject court orders, and they may already be lying to courts about who has had access to what, right? Then, I mean, we're in a whole different world. We're in a whole different world, and that, then it becomes everything is contingent.
Well, and then besides getting hold of our congressional leaders, working locally, what organizations do you know of? I've heard about Indivisible as one, where
They've been
did
doing some great
53
work.
protests in 50 states in one day. Indivisibles. Besides that, what other ones do you know of that we can join?
I mean,
support?
I would look locally, right? So in New York, where I am, there's Make the Road, which has been doing community organizing around key issues for decades now, right? So they are not new to the fight. They know people. They know how to mobilize people. They know how to target people at like city government or state government, where to apply the pressure points, right? Look for those kinds of organizations in your own spaces. And that some of that is just going to have to talk to folks, right? Whether that's at your own church or whether there's like a neighborhood organization or other parents at school, right? Start to talk to people about their awareness of who's doing that kind of work and has some experience at it, right? And again, it's like, it's part of why I warned against, parachuting in and, and I get the urge and I'm encouraging the urge, but approach it with some humility and assume that there are already people doing the work on the ground near you. The more you are out with them, the more you will actually, more that it becomes visible to you, right? The more that you see the work that's going on.
Great. I've had my turn. My just one most important question now is, if we could just disseminate this video all over the internet, if there's some way that you folks can release it, get it out there, it would supercharge so many people. Are you and NASW willing to get this out on the airwaves, get it out on the internet? How far could you take this dynamic, phenomenal presentation?
I mean, that's a question for Lynn. I mean, I'm happy to share.
Yeah, this will be going up on the NASW Vermont website. I mean, we have to download and upload and download and upload, but it will be there. The rest is kind of up to you.
And will be openly available
It'll
to
be
folks.
openly available.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
it won't
great.
be behind. It won't be behind a paywall or anything.
And can you share it with the national NASW perhaps?
Oh yeah.
Thank you very much. I've had my turn.
Yeah,
Thank you. I
thank you,
appreciate it.
Catherine. And I'm going to ask one question from the chat, and then
Yep.
Jordan, and then Kelly. Where do you find the most accurate information on what is happening and how to speak to people who think this stuff is okay?
Yeah. Two different but related questions. We live in a bifurcated and polluted information environment. And there is no getting around that, right? So there is no single answer to where you go to get good reporting, right? I can say the places where I've seen the deepest real reporting, Wired magazine around the Musk stuff, right? Because they've got good connections in the tech world. So they have been able to burrow in there. Places, the sort of the big media places are a mixed bag. Washington Post has done some really lazy, sloppy coverage, but there was a long piece, I think just this morning or last night, again, trying to figure out specifically what's going on at Treasury. That was like really deeply reported in the kind of way you can only do when you have resources like that for a big national outlet. Rolling Stone has been pretty good on some of this. What I would say, Lawfare, Lawfare, those that for some of you that may be more information than you want, but it's been really detailed analysis of the legal action, as you might expect, right? That's their focus, and they tend to focus on national security issues. But most of this has national security implications. So they've been paying a lot of attention, and they have lots of super smart people who are really knowledgeable, often with their own long histories of experience in the State Department or in Treasury or in CIA or in other agencies. So again, they've got connections so that they can go in there. There's nothing that you can take at face value, right? Because right, bifurcated, polluted information environment. But you can start to develop your own trusted sources, right? And share things with friends and neighbors. If you find something that you think, right, and this requires work. This is the problem, right? These fights require labor, and some of that labor is you've actually got to then do some reading and analysis. You can't just say, I know that if I go to news outlet X, then I will be covered. You will not be. I would say as a rule, stay away from X, stay away from Facebook. They are owned by some of the same people who may be engaged in a hostile takeover of the US government. Blue Sky is, in my experience so far, looking a little bit like what Twitter looked like in the old days before it became terrible and noxious. And more academics and reporters are finding themselves there. So I'm getting more of people who are doing on the ground reporting in real time, sharing it. I've been doing this long enough that I know the ones who I trust, right? It's like, oh, yep, they're a serious reporter. They would not be pushing this out into the world unless they'd confirmed this with at least 2 or 3 sources, right? How do you convince people who don't think it's real? I think we've got to start making the connections, right? And again, they're going to see it, right? There were stories late last week of Head Start and daycare programs shutting down because their access to federal funding was cut off, right? If in fact they start cutting funding for the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, you're going to see rural hospitals start to close or shut down services. You've got to make those connections, right? This is not happening in a vacuum. This is being made to happen by people who lied to you in order to get elected, right? I think going back to the earlier conversation, right? I mean, you know this, right? Look at this audience, right? You're not going to get anywhere by calling people stupid, right? How could you have believed this? That is not going to open up those spaces. But if you say, I am really sorry this is happening. I am sorry this is happening too. And I am so sorry that you were lied to. Let's figure out what we can do together to stop this from happening and make it better for the people we care about.
Thank you. Jordan, do you want to take yourself off of mute?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Hi. So my question, and I kind of dropped a little bit in the chat earlier, but that thing moves quickly, is so it's in regard to some of the executive orders that were passed, one in particular being the ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling.
Yeah.
I'm the mental behavioral health specialist for the middle school and high school in my area.
Yeah.
And in this, which I provided a snippet from it for anyone who may not be familiar, they address social transitioning, which, as you can see looking around the room, quote unquote, we have individuals who have marked, their pronouns, she, her, they, them, he, him, and that's included in social transitioning as far as anyone who would like to go by a preferred name or a different pronoun than their gender assigned at birth. And that is now one of those things that is not allowed, and is, when you read further into this document, it includes the statement of like action being taken against those who unlawfully facilitate the social transitioning of a minor student.
Yep.
I was curious what y'all's thoughts were on that, when, like, I know for myself, I have a lot of students who are non-binary, who go by they, them, who have different preferred names.
Yep.
And now that's something that's considered unlawful for me to respect.
Are you in a public school?
I am.
How's between us? How's your principal? Okay.
One is great.
I mean, I asked that question in part because you can't do this on your own. You need to look for spaces where there are people who will have your back, right? I should back up. First thing is, you know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You've got to make your students feel safe and protected, right? And you've got to make your own decisions about how you do that and how much risk you are able to take upon yourself in doing that. But that seems to be job one, right? Is making sure those children feel safe and that there's someone who is there to protect them. Then I would worry about protecting yourself, right? So think about, right, sort of, if, look at an organizational chart, right? Who do you know you can trust? Who has more authority and power than you do, right? Set up a conversation with them. This is awful. This is like East German police state stuff. Don't do it over unsecured communication. Do it in
I've had
person
quite the
or
issue actually with my area, where a lot of identifiable information gets transferred through email, and in a school system, we function under open source. So I am constantly having to remind people or tell them, hey, you just broke confidentiality. Hey, you just broke confidentiality. Heads up, you're still breaking confidentiality. So that's been
yeah. And that's tough because those are, institutional decisions about what systems are used for communication. But yes, right, that shouldn't be happening anyway, it certainly shouldn't be happening now when we've got to worry about people's safety. The other thing that I would suggest, and again, thinking up the hierarchy, is do you have a city council person, an assembly person, a state rep, a state senator, who again, you have reason to trust? Is there someone in your state attorney general's office who you trust or you know of that you can reach out to and say, I'm looking for a little guidance here? Right? Can you tell me what the state, because I'm not going to try to describe what the state of the law is right now, because it is in complete and total flux and varies enormously from place to place to place, right? So I could not tell you anything authoritative about what you can and cannot do. And that's not going to do you any good anyway, because the law could change tomorrow, right? All of this will be moving through the courts. Courts are slow, right? So, I mean, does that help? I know that feels terribly unsatisfying.
No, I understand. It's one of those things where like we don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I guess like my concern is, and we do have a meeting coming up with our supervisor Thursday in regards to some of this as well. Is like it's kind of like the how you said like the like version one. I know when they first removed the Roe v. Wade, they targeted a lot of the medical professionals, a lot of the
Yep.
doctors and nurses who were providing those kind of care in like the clinics. And now I'm like, now I feel like this is a way to target like counselors and therapists and social workers, because I'm not going to not use my client's preferred pronoun or preferred name. I feel like it would be unethical and disrespectful to dead name them.
Yep.
And I guess like the balance we're trying to figure out, like me and my other people in the field, we're trying to figure out is this something where they have grounds to fire us? Is this something where they're going to start arresting therapists, counselors, social workers? Are they going to start revoking our licenses? So like that's where our brains are going, is like, how far are they going to take this in regards to the social transition, unlawful social transition?
Two things I'll say. One is to echo myself from earlier, depends on how far ultimately we're willing to let them take it, right? That's part of the answer, is to look for the spaces where we have power. The other thing I might suggest is look for if there's a local like Lambda Legal Defense Fund or ACLU chapter that works on LGBTQ plus issues, right? And reach out to them, right? They are probably buried right now, but they're going to be able to also tell you the state of play. And this may be you, this may not be you. They're going to be looking for test cases, right? They're going to be looking to litigate this. And you don't litigate as a general rule in the abstract. You need clients who will suffer a harm and then, right, object to that harm formally through the court system. Again, that may or may not be you, but that is what those organizations are already doing, right? They are looking for test cases to challenge these kinds of laws wherever they can. Keeping in mind, and many of you know this, there are plenty of states who have been walking down this path for quite some time now, right? Started arguably with the made up CRT stuff in order to impose restrictions on recognizing that race is a thing, evidently, or that it is an important part of our history, but moved very quickly on to adding in trans folks in particular. But, you know, as a gay man, that is not where that ends, right? It's like my people are next on that list, I can tell you, right? So those will keep expanding. Yeah.
Oh, and Stephen, I'll also jump in that NASW Legal Defense Fund has worked
Okay.
on its own and in partnership with like ACLU and others with these types of cases when social workers are targeted. Kelly, you had your hand up next.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay, Stephen? Thank you so much for this. It's incredibly timely and important. Just wanted to say a couple quick things. One is, and please push back on this if you disagree, but I think going with Timothy Snyder's, don't obey in advance, I worry that Trump's executive orders are not legal. These aren't things that have gone through Congress, but we're treating them like they're now true. And I think that's one of the most important things we have to do, to your question, Jordan, is him writing it doesn't make it so. So if you go towards it, you're giving it legitimacy. And then
100%.
the Braver Angels question earlier, I understand the intention of groups like that, but I think there can be a fundamental flaw when the idea is that we're going to meet in the middle around human rights and
Yep.
like the existence of trans people
Yeah.
and the existence of human rights for women and people of color. So I really, really, really don't think that's the best use of our time. And I'm putting a link in the chat from an amazing article that came out March of 2017 that really guided all of my thinking in the last 8 years. And one of the key points, which is number 5 in here, is sort of a little spectrum of like active opponents, passive opponents, neutral, passive allies, and active allies. And I have really directed my own activism over the last 8 years to moving passive allies to being active allies. I don't engage with active opposition or passive. I try to take people who seem frozen but want to be in action and give them the phone number of their rep and suggest things that they could say. So putting my own energy towards moving people from being passive allies to being active allies, I think is much more powerful. And someone mentioned the 50 state capital protests. There's more of those on President's Day. So on February 17th at 11 a.m. It's really important to understand this is an evolution in organizing, which is decentralized organizing. So they're not organized by Indivisible. This is, there's not people applying for permits. There's not people putting their names on, we're organizing this. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. Of like our own security at protests and how we think about that. So you have to don't substitute anyone's judgment for your own around security, but there are more protests on President's Day at 11 a.m. 50 state capital.
And
Thank
there
you.
are, thank you for that, Kelly. There are all kinds of good guidelines online, some of them through folks like the ACLU and other sort of more grassroots organizing groups who will tell you how to think about whether you want to go to a protest and how you want to be there and what you should be prepared for, and making decisions like, am I going to get arrested, right? Do I want to get arrested? Am I able to get arrested? If I'm going to do that, what do I need to do? Should I leave my phone at home? Should I write the number of a lawyer on my arm, right? Do not go into those spaces without thinking those questions through, right? Because without your own safety has to be job one, because right, if you're not doing okay, you can't do anything for anybody else who needs to be doing okay. And also I like the idea of thinking about those kind of matrices of persuadable people, recognizing that I think different people might see the role that they can play in different quadrants of that matrix. And, what each of you individually has the capacity and the willingness to do is going to differ by as many people as we have here in the room, right? I think in this moment, what matters is that we all pick something and we do it. That's how we get to the other end of this, right? Is through collectively, right, insisting that we will not let this happen. This is not going to happen. And we're going to leave what we can on the table and not let it happen. Easier said than done, I know.
Just a comment from the chat, and there's a lot of them. Here's the thing: unlawful things have been occurring for marginalized people for a while without this much concern that we see now. It's now time to get on board with the organizations, grassroots, locally, et cetera, that have been trying to bring movements forward and get out of the comfort zone.
100%. This is not the first moment that we have been living under an authoritarian regime, right? And first enslaved people and then their descendants have been living under an authoritarian regime for somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 years. Maybe broken a little bit in 1865 to 1877, when we had a brief period when we enforced the outcome of the Civil War at gunpoint, literally occupied the South, right? And had enormously positive results. This is why I go back to Reconstruction, right? We were actually engaged in building a multiracial democracy at the end of the Civil War. And it ended in 1877 through a whole bunch of messy, corrupt bargains. And then we had a system that replicated much of those systems right up until 1964, 1965. Best way to frame this is that we have maybe been a democracy since the mid 60s and still not for everyone. I think part of what's happening is that because of those advances, right? You know, it's not just the racial civil rights movement. It was the women's rights movement, right? It was the gay liberation movement. It was abortion rights movement, right? Certain categories of people, disproportionately white men, who thought that they were entitled to rule, lost their damn minds and have been fighting against that expansive notion of what this democracy can and should look like, and have gained more power now than they have had arguably since that previous period, right? But this ain't new to large segments of us, 100%. Right. And I didn't even sort of gesture toward the experience of Native populations, right? We've had a long, ugly history. This is now breaching into quarters that have not experienced this before.
How can we connect around our areas of interest? I'm passionate about Medicaid and behavioral health care. I live in Vermont, but work and I'm licensed in Arizona, and that's making me feel disconnected.
That's a good question. That's tough. I mean, I guess, I might throw this to you, Lynn, right? Are there organizations of health professionals in Vermont that the questioner could connect with?
Yeah, well, I'm also thinking just in terms of but working in Arizona. So there are one of the great things and one of the challenges about NASW is that we've got that huge umbrella, right, of any and all social justice issues. That's why we often within the chapters work in partnership with other organizations. Like, for example, I use reproductive rights, right? We are definitely on board. And so, but we're not the ones out leading the charge. That's why we partner with Planned Parenthood, because they've got all the resource, all the information. And so lifting up and amplifying and directing people to the work being done there. So there are some things where NASW can absolutely be out in front, but oftentimes we're working in partnership with others. So I would connect with your local NASW chapter saying, who are you partnering with? And then we can direct you to, oh, this is the organization. So that now you're connected to two organizations that are working in partnership to some degree.
Yep.
And if that partnership isn't there, then it's incumbent upon me and the other executive director, like, to build those partnerships. Does that, I'm hoping that answers the question in some way. Oh, sorry. And I'm looking to see if somebody has a handout because I'm like now scrolling. There's lots and lots of great resources in here. I worry that social work will be a target of the right, considering what's happening with diversity, equity, and inclusion and all.
I think it's not irrational to worry. I think one of the things that might save us, at least in the short term as a profession, is that I don't think we're on their radar. I don't think they think about us and what we do, and the kind of work we do, right? Other than the fact that, you know, the lots of the populations we work with and for are those that they have identified as enemies. But that's a lot of that is, again, it's what are the institutions that can serve as bulwarks, right? Does more pressure need to be pushed on NASW to be more active and aggressive in particular kinds of ways? As Lynn said, are there other kinds of local partnerships that you could help form in order to get that sort of institutional protective barrier, right? Going back to talking about the school social worker earlier, right? This is harder if you are on your own and you are unable to gauge risk and don't know if there are people who've got your back, right? Right. Have the backs of the people whose backs you can have, and then find people who can have your back.
I'll also just say, I mean, social workers were kind of built for this, right? And those who may be more clinically focused need to kind of reach back to those policy classes. And my students will often hear me say micro macro is a false dichotomy. They are
Yep.
the same
Yep.
skills.
Yep.
Do you have any advice or thoughts on responding to clients who are supportive of this administration?
I mean, I think it depends so much on the context, right? What is the context in which that conversation is taking place? And I'm not a clinician, so I'm doubly hesitant to venture into that terrain. But does that seem like a fair response? It depends on what the context is and what you're talking about, Lynn.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the micro macro is a false dichotomy again. So, I mean, you join with your clients. This, you got to remember what your role is, self-determination, and go back to all the, like with any cognitive bias, right? Whatever the cognitive bias is, that's what you need to take into consideration. So I'm seeing somebody, and it's just iPad. I don't have a name. If you'd like to ask your question.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It's Caroline. Actually, my question had to do with, I mean, I'm mostly retired now, but I do clinical supervision. Some of my groups have interns. I'm always trying to figure out activities for the people that I am supervising, either toward an MSW or a licensed clinical social worker, that involves macro activities, because we're in a mental health agency. So it's very much, individual, small group. I remember back, I don't know, like 2018 or something, I had my interns write letters to their Congress people about the changes in Medicaid, what block grants for Medicaid would mean. And I don't know, they didn't even know who their representatives were. So they had to figure that out. And so I'm always working on that. Do you have any ideas about that?
I would say post September 11th, don't send letters, because the process of screening mail that goes into Congress now is so elaborate that unless it's going on a separate track, it doesn't get to those offices for ages. Call. But as you suggest, have some facts at hand. And the more that you can, this goes back to the Lynn point about the macro and the micro being the same thing. The more that you can tell a personal story, right, about a constituent of that member who is going to be adversely affected by a policy, right? And the more you know about that policy and what those effects are likely to be, right? The more, I mean, and these are around the margins things, but enough people do this stuff, it really does matter. And if you ever turn into hearing debate on the floor of the House or Senate, which I don't necessarily recommend, you will very often hear a member stand up and say, I want to read to you something I got from one of my constituents who called today, who is really worried about what this is going to mean to X. right? So that's what I said earlier about like politics hasn't ended, right? That stuff, as long as we have a legislature, that stuff still matters, and those people can be moved, connected always locally. Show them that this is going to make people mad at them when the next election comes along.
And Stephen, if I can just
Yeah.
add to that, and then Barry, I'm going to come to you, is for social workers to remember you are content experts.
Yep.
You know how policies affect your clients and your communities. You have a basis of knowledge from which to speak. Barry, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks. I've always been a big fan. Bought the book a few years ago, and it's
Well, just one of them?
just one. Yeah, yeah. I may need a new set. Maybe I'll put it together as a box set with On Tyranny.
See, now you're thinking.
Yeah. So I think a lot of I'm trying to tie together a lot of what you started with in the webinar about the purpose of the shock and awe, the sense of overwhelm,
Yep.
The drive to withdraw and isolate, and how we as social workers, I mean, that's our swing zone. And this is not a short-term effort. This is long-term. So I think, and one of the things I'm doing in my community is developing a group that is about self-care and community connections. So we are doing that work of creating capacity and sustainability by building community around just simple things. There could be supply chain disruptions. So let's do more community gardening and trading of resources. Let's make sure that we're meeting on a regular basis for conversation and planning. And I think this is the swing zone that social workers bring to the effort. And so many people have spoken about, not everybody is going to be, on the street kicking indoors. Not everybody's going to put their body on the line. Not everybody should be, because that's not how we're trained. That's not how we're built. Our swing zone, I think, in addition to policy and political action, is about building self-care and community connections to promote that sustainability that we're going to need for the next at least 4 years.
Yep. And longer. This problem is not gone in 4 years. Right. This is the project of the rest of my life. Right. Probably a little longer.
Yeah. Shannon, you want to take yourself off mute?
Yeah, so I work at a community health center that provides care to a lot of vulnerable populations that are being targeted, including immigrants and people who receive trans or gender affirming care. The social work team has been really pushing the administration to come up with a plan to protect patients who are at risk.
Yep.
And we keep getting pushback and told we're alarmists. What can we do to convince the people in leadership roles that there is a real threat?
Is it your read that do they genuinely believe what they're saying to you about about you being alarmist, or do they just not want or know how to deal with this and they're using that as an excuse? Do you have a read on which of those two things it is?
Yeah, I think they do care. I think they just don't believe that the threat is real.
I mean, I guess, I would go to some of, the organizations that, the ACLU, I forget what they've call that section, the LGBTQ plus section webpage, right? And they will often literally be sort of, tracking hostile legislative and other kinds of acts, right? Will track cases of, folks who have been denied care, right? There's the case that's gotten a little bit of coverage because it's gotten a court injunction, but there was an order to move all trans folks who are in federal prisons, right, to a prison that would match their gender assigned at birth. which is wildly unsafe for all kinds of folks. And there has been a temporary restraining order. It's not exactly the space that you're working in, but it's very much the flavor of what we are seeing going on, right? People who have identified as, to quote the president, enemies of the people, right? And who are being systematically, or maybe not so systematically, targeted for, what is it, ostracization, punishment, a reassertion of some absurd notion that they think of as happening in the 1950s of what a family should, right? I mean, this is all sort of incredibly backwards, is a polite way, I guess, of putting it, stuff. Maybe it's start collecting news stories and sharing them with those administrators. If you've got patients or clients who have had negative personal experiences, see if there's a forum in which they can communicate that, right? Make it real, make it personal, right? It's like, we're not talking about abstractions here. We're talking about people who we have a responsibility of care for, and you are being derelict of duty by pretending that it's not a problem. You may not want to frame it that way, but that's how I would frame it. But I'm a middle-aged white man with a PhD, so I can get away with saying things like that in those spaces where other people often cannot. But it may take some pushing, right? You may just need to be really stubborn. And again, like all the other stuff, do it with others, right? If there's a group of you who are feeling that this is urgent and it needs the institution's attention and they're not taking it seriously, band together, insist on scheduling a meeting, right? Doesn't necessarily need to be confrontational, but, again, go back to those clinical skills, right? We are not feeling heard and we are concerned, so we would like an opportunity to communicate that to you if you are willing, right? And try to create a space in that environment where they take you seriously, where you've got evidence that it's real, and then to the extent that you can, propose solutions. Because that's always easier if you're not saying, here's a problem, fix it. But if you're able to say, here are a couple of things that I can think that we could do relatively easily, right? And you're probably going to have, right, they're going to probably want the institution's lawyers in the room at that point. And that's probably not a bad idea at this point either.
Thank you. Crystal, I see your hand up.
Hi. So tuning in from the great purple state of Wisconsin, I'm a school social worker at an elementary. I hear you as saying like the stories you're sharing, right? Like I have students that are trans, even at elementary, we know, and parents that are scared and it's affecting and all of that stuff.
Yep.
And I have a high population of new to the country families. So just, everybody right now that is in fear. My question about calling and making calls. So we had local here, someone who wrote a very nice email, very professional, educated email to their representatives. And that said representative looked up her name and employer and called her employer and said that she was threatening a political official with her email, which she wasn't. And they called the Capitol Police on them as well, and they came back and said that she didn't do anything wrong. Her letter was fine, but it's a tactic to silence. And first of all, I want people to be aware that's happening because it happened in our circle of friends. I mean, I hang out with a lot of social workers, and but second of all, so do we share when I'm calling and saying stories like those personal stories, like I am a social worker, or should we not be drawing attention to the profession? How do I share stories on behalf of my kids? I guess I'm just like nervous now that they're doing things like that, but that's what they want. So maybe I just need reassurance and like continuing to, I don't know. Does that make sense? It's just kind of a scary world where they're finding out your employers and calling and putting in formal complaints. So this person who did nothing wrong and used her freedom of speech to write a letter, then dealt with all of that afterwards.
It makes all the sense in the world, unfortunately. I think this is another one of those instances in which you have to make that decision for yourself, right? Obviously, and I'm sure this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway, right? You do not want to be releasing any information about the individual who is not you that you are talking about. But, to the extent that you are willing to, communicate, this is who I am and this is where I teach and, I'm a constituent and this is what I think, I might refer you to what I said earlier, right? Are there going to be people who have your back, right? There was a years ago now, I was closely associated with someone who became Glenn Beck's enemy of the day, if you remember Glenn Beck. And it was awful. She was like traveling around with bodyguards and whatever. And I was concerned that that was going to start to spill over to me because I had been writing some things in a similar vein. This was back in the Twitter days. And went to my institution and said, nothing to worry about right now. But here are a couple of case studies of when faculty members have been under attack in other institutions. And I literally had, right, ever the professor, right, case studies. One of them was, here's where I think they really handled this well and set up systems. And here's an instance in which they really did not protect their faculty member and horrible things happened, right? Is there opportunity for that kind of educational project in your institution so that you can have some assurance? And if you can't, right? And again, that may take working in groups, but if you can't feel comfortable about that, then that's a decision you have to make, right? And I referenced in the beginning of my talk, right? Some members of Congress off the record saying, well, the reason that there hasn't been more resistance in Congress is because they're being flooded with death threats, right? We live in a country where there are literally more guns than there are people, right? In which in just the most previous presidential election campaign, there were 2 assassination attempts. So those are not necessarily irrational fears, right? There was a judge in New Jersey who got shot dead 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because of a decision that she made, right? So those are unfortunately not entirely irrational fears, but as you pointed out, creating that kind of fear of speaking out and acting out is precisely part of the tactic and how those kinds of authoritarian takeovers succeed. And I'll say it again, everybody's got to make their own decisions about what their risk level is, right? And to not do anything without thinking carefully about what it means. And to the extent that you can be strategic, right? And again, have a conversation with other people you trust.
And Stephen, we are almost to the end. So if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before I stop the recording and give people logistical stuff again.
First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the work that you are doing in what is an extraordinarily difficult moment. I'll go back to something that I said earlier. You don't have to do everything, right? You don't have to pay attention to everything, right? Make sure you and the people most immediately around you are taken care of. And then pick a thing or two that you feel you have the capacity to do it and commit to doing it, right? And if each and every one of us finds way to do that and to do it with others and to reach out to others for support when we need it, right? And to, do the things that we know about for self-care, right? Are we doing our best to get sleep and to eat well and, not finish every evening with a very large cocktail in order to reduce the stress levels, right? Which we're already seeing evidence is happening. Do that work, reach out to others, form community, and be firm in the knowledge that history is littered with the carcasses of despots. And we can litter the present with the carcass, metaphorical and eventual literal, given the way the time works, of another one. We've just got to commit to the work.
be helpful. Thank you very much. And I am going to stop the recording.